Hello everyone. My name is Daichi, and I will give you the lecture regarding the radiation or remediation activities. So, let's start today's lecture. Today's theme is Exposure Situations, Volume 2. Are you ready? Okay, last time I talked about the three categories of exposure situations, and today I would like to talk about, for example, the concept of radiation protection in each exposure situation. Before going into detail, I would like to talk about the categories of exposure. Last time we focused on the surrounding situation under which we are exposed to radiation, but this time we focus more on the people who are exposed to radiation. In this regard, there are three categories of exposures. That is, occupational exposure, medical exposure, and public exposure. First of all, occupational exposure. As its name also represents, it means the exposure derived from people's occupation. For examples, it includes the exposure during experiment using radioactive materials, and the exposure of workers during decontamination activities after the accident of nuclear power plant. The next exposure is medical exposure. As its name also represents, it means the exposure of patient or its families, which derives from diagnosis or treatment of diseases. The last exposure is public exposure. This is the exposure other than the two types of exposures mentioned above, occupational and medical exposure. And as its name represents, it means the exposure of ordinary people in their daily life. Of course, it includes the exposure to the radiation derived from radioactive materials in the earth or atmosphere. So, as mentioned in another lecture, the categories of exposure can be categorized into three, and taking together with three categories of exposure situations, 9 categories can be assumed, by multiplying 3 by 3, if putting it simply. However, this lecture mainly covers the decontamination or subsequent recovery processes, and it's going to be too lengthy if I explain all of them. Therefore, the medical exposure is not covered here, because it is comparatively less related with this lecture.
Okay, I understand the categories of exposure situations and types of exposure. So what are the basic concepts for the radiation protection in each situation or type of exposure?
So, let's begin with planned exposure situation. Important concepts under the planned exposure situation are dose limit and dose constraint.
Dose limit and dose constraint. These are the words I hear for the first time. What are those supposed to mean?
Okay, first of all, dose limit. This is the value determined to regulate the exposure dose derived from radioactive sources, which are intentionally introduced and utilized. With regard to the effective dose to the public, ICRP recommends to keep it 1 millisievert or less per year. And with regard to the dose limit derived from occupational exposure, under the planned exposure situation, is recommended to be kept not more than 100 millisievert for every 5 years, as well as 50 millisievert for every single year.
By the way, why are dose limits so different between public and professional people, although they are anyway same human?
This is the very good question. It includes my personal viewpoint. But, one of the reasons is, the exposure dose, which we are covered here, is much less than the exposure dose, which might cause serious acute radiological hazard, called deterministic effect. And another reasons are, I think that the professional workers usually monitor their exposure dose, by using, for example, the personal dosimeter. And they can also manage their health condition, by taking the periodical health check.
On the other hand, it seems not to be realistic for all ordinary people to manage their exposure dose, and take health check relevant to exposure dose periodically. Therefore, more strict standard might be applied to ordinary people.
The next concept is dose constraint. This is the target value to reduce the exposure dose derived from a source, as low as possible. For example, when assuming the case in which the activities of multiple businesses, which introduced radioactive sources, might make impacts on an ordinary person. The annual dose limit of 1 millisievert per year is subjected to be allocated to each business, with some proportion. The allocated value is the dose constraint.
Okay, so under the planned exposure situation, the upper limit of exposure dose is determined first, and it is allocated to each source. So, what are the concepts under the emergency exposure situation and existing exposure situation?
Today I have talked a lot, so I would like to explain it in detail in the next lecture. And also in some time in another lecture, I would like to talk about the impact on human health caused by the exposure to radiation, like deterministic effect. So, let me wrap up my lecture by providing you the key points. Today, first I talked about 3 categories of exposure, by focusing on the people who are exposed to radiation. That is, occupational exposure, medical exposure, and public exposure. And for the next, I talked about dose limits and dose constraint, which are important indices under planned exposure situation. First, dose limit is the limit value to control the exposure dose derived from the radioactive sources, which are intentionally introduced and managed. The ICRP recommends that the effective dose of public exposure needs to be 1 millisievert or less per year, and occupational exposure needs to be 100 millisievert or less for every 5 years, as well as 50 millisievert or less for every single year. And the last one is dose constraint. This is the exposure dose, given by allocating dose limit to each radioactive source. Okay, today's lecture is now dismissed. See you next time. In this channel, the useful information regarding the radiation and remediation will be provided to you. If you like it, please subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to click the like button.